The little village of Willowburg was one of those places which seemed to resist the passing of time. A cluster of neat cottages with thatched roofs, ivy climbing up stone walls, and rose gardens blooming in orderly rows. It possessed an air of serenity that visitors often found enviable. The outside world might roar with the troubles of politics and war, but here life appeared to move gently, punctuated only by the ringing of the church bells, the gossip at the post office, and the chatter at the weekly market. On this particular June afternoon, the village was gathered upon the vicarage lawn for the annual summer fete. It was one of those events where everyone, from the squire's lady to the humblest gardener's wife, could be found wandering from stall to stall. The air was fragrant with the mingling scents of strawberries, freshly baked scones, and the roses that bordered the lawn. Children darted about in mischievous packs, their laughter mingling with the shrill calls of vendors auctioning off jams and preserves for church funds. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably seated beneath a large striped parasol, surveyed the scene with mild amusement. Dressed in her customary pale summer dress, a little lace collar fastened at the throat, and a neat straw hat perched on her silver hair, she appeared every inch the gentle spinster. Yet those who knew her well, though few truly did, understood that behind the soft blue eyes and delicate knitting needles, which she now employed with calm regularity, was a mind as sharp as any barrister's. From her vantage point she observed the comings and goings of her neighbors, cataloguing their little vanities and indiscretions. Human nature, she often reflected, never changed. It merely repeated itself in endless variations. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose, moving slowly yet purposefully towards the gathering. The murmurs were rising now, speculation spreading like wildfire. A heart attack, someone whispered. Too much excitement. Yet others were less certain. Noting the peculiar stillness of the widow's body, the teacup dropped so tightly in her hand. By evening the fete was over, but talk of Mrs. Amelia Price's collapse filled Willowbrook. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett declared, "Not a natural faint at all," still clutching her cup. At the Crown and Anchor, Mr. Pottle thumped the bar. Poison, that's what it was. Few disagreed. Miss Marple walked home slowly, noting how death stripped away villagers' masks. Mrs. Clement met her at the vicarage gate, pale. "The coroner is called. It is dreadful." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "but dreadful things rarely arrive without a little cloud first." The inquest was held the next day. Dr. Cartwright testified that Mrs. Price's heart was sound enough for her age. "I would not exclude poison," he admitted at last. That word ran through the village like fire. Lucy, the maid, trembled on the stand. "She always brought her own cup, ma'am. I poured the tea from the urn and set it down. She left it when Lady Whitcomb spoke to her. Anyone might have touched it." Lady Whitcomb herself looked strained. She insisted she had no quarrel, though her husband's clock, now in Mrs. Price's possession, was a sore point. "I only asked if she had won anything," she said. "I never touched her, see you." The curate, Mr. Fenton, spoke quietly of confusion near the raffle. He glanced more than once at Florence Green, who sat twisting her gloves. Florence blushed and stammered that she had noticed nothing. Then Inspector Graves arrived from the county town. A ruddy, practical man, he declared, "Close circle, cup of tea, one woman dead. We shall not be long." Miss Marple, listening in her neat way, thought to herself that cases promising speed often proved the slowest. Graves inspected the vicarage kitchen and the fete tables, Lucy trailing behind him nervously. "You poured the tea, girl." "Fact," he said. "Yes, sir, but she set it down," Lucy whispered. "I was fetching scones." Miss Marple interjected mildly. "It is curious, is it not, that Mrs. Price's habit of a special cup should make the task so much simpler for anyone who wished her harm?" The inspector smiled at her kindly, the way men do at elderly ladies. "Quite so, madam, quite so." Mrs. Cartwright swept in briskly. "Surely the girl must be questioned more closely, Inspector. The whole village is uneasy until this is settled." Graves bristled. "The girl will tell me what she did, no more, no less." Miss Marple noted the eagerness in Mrs. Cartwright's tone. It fitted with the curious triumph Miss Marple had glimpsed on her lips at the fete. By afternoon the verdict of the villagers was fixed. Lucy had done it. Who else poured the tea? Who else bore Mrs. Price's scoldings? Miss Marple disliked neat explanations. She called on Lucy at her small lodging. The girl's eyes were swollen with tears. "They say I did it, miss, but I swear I didn't." "I believe you," Miss Marple said kindly. "A guilty person chooses a quieter moment, not a public fete. Tell me, how did Mrs. Price carry her cup?" "In a little basket lined with a cloth." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "a cloth." That evening Miss Marple sat by her fire, noting the threads already forming a pattern: the special cup, Lucy's honesty, Lady Whitcomb's nerves, Florence's blushes, Mrs. Cartwright's bright insistence. And outside Dr. Cartwright's garden foxgloves stood tall in the dusk, their purple bells swaying gently. Poisons, Miss Marple reflected, often come dressed as flowers, and human motives, though hidden, were rarely so pretty. She picked up her knitting with calm precision. The inspector might be satisfied with Lucy. Miss Marple was not. Inspector Graves began the morning with determination. "Close circle, cup of tea, one woman dead," he declared. "We shall not be long." Lucy was summoned first. Pale and shaking, she admitted she had poured Mrs. Price's tea into her special cup. But Mrs. Price had left it on the table when Lady Whitcomb spoke to her. "I went to fetch scones, sir. When I looked back, she had taken it up again." And the cloth? Miss Marple asked gently. Lucy nodded. She always carried it in a basket lined with a little cloth. The inspector searched among the fate linens, and Miss Marple, moving neatly, uncovered a small printed square with cherries. One corner bore a faint, irregular stain. Dr. Cartwright examined it briefly. A residue of some sort. Best tested. Mrs. Cartwright's voice rang out. I do hope, Inspector, this tedious matter with the maid can be concluded. The village will rest easier. Graves frowned. The girl will tell me what she did and did not do. Nothing more. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Cartwright's eager tone and tucked it away in her mind. Robert Price was next. He arrived carelessly dressed, irritated at being called. Graves wasted no time. You quarreled with your aunt at Mr. Sims's last week. You needed money. Where were you when the raffle began? Sampling strawberry jam, Robert said loftily. 2 spoonfuls, if I recall, Mrs. Cartwright snapped. Robert flushed. I was doing my duty to village produce. Miss Marple remarked gently, Jam can tell one a surprising quantity about its maker. It is awkward when labels are changed. Mrs. Cartwright's lips tightened. I changed nothing. Graves returned to Robert. Did you see Mrs. Price's cup unattended? I was minding my own concerns, Robert said, clearly uncomfortable. Not a crime, Graves replied. But we shall see. Miss Marple paid a call on Lady Whitcomb, who received her with strained dignity. I did not touch Amelia's cup, she insisted. I only asked if she had won anything. Miss Marple admired a mantelpiece clock and remarked, Clocks and reputations are alike, they must be carefully kept. That clock of your late husband's caused talk, did it not? Lady Whitcomb winced. A lapse, years ago. A loan repaid, but the clock never returned. I prefer not to dwell on it. Her fingers smoothed an invisible crease. Miss Marple noted the nervous habit and let the matter rest. Florence Green was found twisting her gloves. I don't know anything, Miss Marple, she said, blushing. Mr. Fenton asked me to help with the children, then the raffle was called and everything happened. You were looking at the curate, Miss Marple said kindly. But when one looks too hard at one person, something else may slip by. Florence hesitated, then whispered, Mrs. Cartwright told me it must have been Lucy. She said the village would be healthier once it was settled. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Mrs. Cartwright is fond of settlements. Mr. Fenton, I think, is fonder of leaving judgment to God. Florence colored. Miss Marple smiled gently and asked no more. Graves pressed Lucy again in the vicarage kitchen. Did you add anything? Sugar, honey, lemon? No, sir. There was no honey. Miss Marple repeated softly, no honey. Yet Mrs. Price preferred it. Mrs. Cartwright said sharply, if there had been honey, I should know. I oversaw the tables myself. Indeed, Miss Marple said. One always knows what one has provided. It is harder to know what someone else may have brought quietly and removed again. Graves waved it aside. The girl poured the tea. That is the fact. Default text. Inspector Graves, with his coat buttoned to the chin and his notebook always at the ready, announced that the business was narrowing itself. We have the maid, the cup, the cloth. The rest is embroidery. It will not be long now. But in Willowbrook nothing ever settled quite as quickly as the inspector liked to believe. The morning after Lucy's second questioning, the village was divided neatly into two camps, those convinced of her guilt, and those who whispered that such wickedness was surely beyond the girl. Both camps, however, were united in one sentiment. They wanted the matter closed. Suspicion had spoiled the village's digestion. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett declared that Lucy's quiet tears proved her guilty conscience. "I've always said crying is no proof of innocence. Look at children. Cry first, deny second." At the inn, Mr. Pottle was equally certain. No girl would dare in front of so many. Poisoners are sly. Someone clever did it. He hinted broadly that Robert Price was seen with a full purse in Marleycombe only yesterday. Miss Marple listened as she waited to post a letter. She did not correct either side. People reveal more, she knew, when one nods sympathetically. Inspector Graves returned to the vicarage hall to interview Lucy again, this time with more sharpness. "You poured the tea," he repeated. "You had charge of the cup. Mrs. Price insulted you often. That is sufficient." Lucy's hands twisted. "I poured it, yes, but she carried her own spoon, sir, and her cloth. She trusted no one. If poison was there, it was before I touched the urn." "Convenient," Graves muttered. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting bag, spoke as if to herself. "Convenient, yes, but consistent too. Lucy has not altered her tale in the smallest detail since the beginning. That is unusual for a liar." Graves frowned, unwilling to admit the point. "Tell me, Lucy, did you see anyone near the cup while it was on the table?" Lucy hesitated. "Mrs. Cartwright was passing by with the scones, sir, and Miss Green was close, talking to her friends. But everyone was moving about. It was the raffle, sir." "I couldn't watch." "Exactly so," Miss Marple said gently. "Everyone's eyes upon the vicar. There are moments in life when one might walk across a crowded stage entirely unseen if the curtain rises just then." Graves tapped his pencil impatiently. "You are fond of fancies, madam. We deal in facts." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "Only, I have often found that facts are like clothes pegs. They hold the washing, but one must still see what is on the line." Robert Price was summoned again, bristling with indignation. "This persecution must end. I am a gentleman." Graves looked unimpressed. "Gentlemen are not exempt from debt, Mr. Price. How did you come by the money you displayed in Marleycombe yesterday?" Robert colored. "A friend assisted me." Miss Marple's needles clicked. Friends are useful. Though I have sometimes noticed they are more useful when one has an inheritance to offer in return. Robert turned cold eyes on her. "I do not care for insinuations, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed mildly. "Few people do." Lady Whitcomb, questioned again, grew defensive. "I spoke only a few words. My hands were nowhere near her cup." "Yet you admit to resentment," Graves pressed. "I admit nothing beyond regret," Lady Whitcomb snapped. Miss Marple studied the lady's gloves, which she had not removed indoors. Nervous hands, always busy. Gloves can conceal more than fingers. That afternoon, Florence Green sat in Miss Marple's sitting room, having been coaxed in for tea. The girl sipped nervously, glancing towards the window as though hoping the curate might appear there. "You saw Mrs. Price set down her cup?" Miss Marple asked. Florence nodded quickly. "Yes, she was scolding Lucy, saying she'd break it." Then Lady Whitcomb came by, and Mrs. Price left it for a moment. And what did you do then? Florence blushed. I was watching Mr. Fenton. He was with the children. I don't know anything else. Miss Marple smiled kindly. One often notices more than one intends. Did you see who stood nearest the cakes? Florence frowned, thinking hard. Mrs. Cartwright, I think. She was hurrying with plates. Hurriedness, Miss Marple said softly, is often a cloak. Later, in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. Cloth with faint stain. Honey absent, though Mrs. Price demanded it. Lucy's story unchanged. Robert suddenly with money. Lady Whitcomb's gloves. Mrs. Cartwright's bustle, eagerness to settle. She tapped her pencil. Human nature was consistent if one knew where to look. She recalled a quarrel in St. Mary Mead years ago. A maid accused of breaking a vase when, in fact, the lady of the house had done so and let the blame stand because it was convenient. Villages did not change. Only the names differed. Her eyes drifted to the garden where the tall foxgloves nodded in the breeze. A beautiful flower, but treacherous if powdered or steeped. Many would not know how to use it. But a doctor's household and a doctor's wife who kept herself briskly informed might. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, prepared his case against Lucy. We have means and opportunity. Motive? Years of abuse. It fits. Miss Marple said nothing. She folded her knitting with precise hands and tucked away her notes. Experience had taught her that arguments were seldom won by contradiction. They were won by patience, by waiting for the one detail that would not sit straight. It would come. They always did. And when it came, she would be ready. By the week's end, Inspector Graves had assembled a picture he found most satisfying. He told Mrs. Clement in a tone of assurance that the matter would soon be brought to a conclusion. There are two lines, he said, both plausible. Either the nephew, who gains financially, or Lady Whitcomb, who bore a lasting grudge. Both had opportunity. Mrs. Clement repeated this faithfully to her friends at the mothers' meeting, and by tea-time the whole village had settled itself comfortably into one of two camps. The Robert faction insisted that debt and inheritance were motive enough for any young man. The Whitcomb faction whispered darkly that pride and humiliation over a family heirloom could drive a lady to desperate action. Miss Marple, passing from house to house with her customary gentle calls, heard both theories advanced with equal conviction. She nodded politely, poured tea, and tucked each detail away. Inspector Graves questioned Robert Price first with all the sternness of a man convinced of guilt. You quarreled with your aunt, you begged for money, and you stand to inherit, he said. What do you have to say? Robert leaned back, attempting nonchalance. I will not deny my aunt could be difficult. Yes, she lent me money. But murder? Really, Inspector, it is absurd. You were seen with money in Marleycombe 2 days ago. A small sum. A friend advanced it. And what security did you offer this friend? Robert's lips curled. Perhaps my company. Perhaps my charm. It is no crime to borrow. Miss Marple, seated in the corner with her knitting, remarked softly, Charm is a very uncertain currency. It depreciates faster than gold, I've found, though it can be persuasive for a time. Robert shot her a glance. I see no reason why an elderly spinster should take such interest in my affairs. Elderly spinsters, Miss Marple said, have observed many affairs and debts too. They notice which are repaid and which are not. Graves interrupted impatiently. You were near the jam stall when the raffle was called. That put you close to the cup. Robert frowned. The whole village was close to the cup, Inspector. You will find that inconvenient. Lady Whitcomb received the inspector at her drawing-room with a chill dignity. I will not be insulted in my own home, she said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I spoke with Amelia Price, yes. I did not touch her cup. My quarrel with her is a matter of record, but I am not a poisoner. You had cause, Graves pressed. That clock was yours. Lady Whitcomb stiffened. It was my husband's. We were forced to part with it in a difficult time. Amelia seized her chance. She gloated over it. But murder? Her voice shook, then hardened. Inspector, I will not endure such insinuations. Miss Marple leaned forward kindly. It is very distressing, Lady Whitcomb. People often exaggerate quarrels after a death. But forgiveness, I think, can be as telling as resentment. One shows itself in the hands as much as the face. Lady Whitcomb's gloved fingers clenched tighter. You are very observant, Miss Marple. One tries, Miss Marple said gently. That afternoon, Willowburg buzzed with the two theories. At the post office, Mrs. Bartlett was certain Robert was guilty. Debts, debts, debts. And where money is concerned, blood soon follows. At the inn, Mr. Pottle swore Lady Whitcomb had done it. Pride's a sharper spur than poverty, he declared. She's been brooding over that clock for years. Florence Green whispered to Miss Marple, I don't believe either. Robert is feckless, but not wicked. And Lady Whitcomb is too proud to lower herself. Miss Marple nodded. Pride and poverty both make excellent suspects, my dear. But sometimes the obvious is not the true. Villages are fond of neat tailies. Spectre Graves pressed his case at the vicarage. The maid is weak, but the nephew and the lady, they have real motives. Means and opportunity are established. It is one of the three. Dr. Cartwright said little, though his wife interjected briskly, the sooner it is settled, the better. The village cannot bear this gossip much longer. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Cartwright's bright expression. Yes, she said mildly. Settlements do ease the mind. Even false ones for a time. Graves frowned. False? What do you mean? Only, Miss Marple said, that people are very ready to accept a solution that fits their prejudices. A maid, a nephew, a proud lady. Very convenient categories, but truth is rarely so tidy. Graves dismissed her words as fancy. He preferred motives that could be written in a line across a page. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting forgotten on her lap. She reviewed the facts. Robert had debts, but debts make men desperate in obvious ways, not subtle ones. Poisoning at a fete was hardly his style. Lady Whitcomb had resentment, yes, but her anger was brittle, not practical. Her hands betrayed nerves, not cunning. Lucy's tail had not shifted once, despite pressure. That constancy was telling. And then there was the curious insistence of Mrs. Cartwright that the matter be settled. Miss Marple recalled how Mrs. Price had scolded the maid over the cup, how Mrs. Cartwright had bustled near the cakes, how her lips had curved with satisfaction when the widow collapsed. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes resting on the foxglove swing in the doctor's garden across the lane, beautiful, poisonous, and growing just where one might reach them every day without remark. Not Robert, not Lady Whitcomb, she murmured. Those are stories for villagers. But the truth is stitched somewhere else. She picked up her knitting and began again, her needles clicking softly. In each stitch she wove the pattern tighter, waiting for the thread that would reveal the design entire. The village had grown restless. Two neat explanations had been provided, Robert with his debts, Lady Whitcomb with her grudge, but neither satisfied for long. Gossip shifted like the wind, and with each new tale came the insistence that it would all be over soon. Miss Marple, walking quietly to the grocer's, overheard Mrs. Bartlett declare, "It must have been Robert. A young man with debts will do anything." And half an hour later, at the butcher's, she heard Mr. Pottle say, "Lady Whitcomb, mark my words, pride and humiliation." That clock was her undoing. The village liked its stories. But Miss Marple knew the truth had not yet spoken. Inspector Graves, however, was convinced the net was closing. He arrived at the vicarage hall to re-examine the fate exhibits. "One last walk through," he told Constable Harris. "The answer will be here." The tables had been stacked against the wall, but the vicar, ever orderly, had drawn a small plan of their arrangement on the day. "This was the urn," he explained. "Here the scones, and here Mrs. Cartwright's cakes." Miss Marple stood close by, nodding politely, but her eyes rested on the small square of printed cotton, the cloth that had lined Mrs. Price's basket. Graves had tossed it aside once the stain was noted, but Miss Marple picked it up with careful fingers. She turned it over. One side bore a faint, irregular mark, darker than tea. But it was not sticky, as jam would have been, nor did it smell of fruit. Instead, there was the faintest scent of something bitter, almost medicinal. She held it to her nose again, then let it fall back into place. "Still worrying at that rag?" Graves asked gruffly. "One does find that cloths tell tales," Miss Marple replied gently. "I once knew a housemaid who carried news of an entire household in the hem of her apron." Graves waved it away. "All very pretty, but this proves nothing," Miss Marple smiled. "Not yet." That afternoon she called at the doctor's house with a small jar of quince jelly for Mrs. Cartwright. She was received with brisk gratitude, the sort that made gifts feel like debts. "I do hope," Mrs. Cartwright said, "that the inspector is firm. This business cannot go on indefinitely. The girl should be dealt with. She is very young," Miss Marple murmured. "One wonders if she could manage such calculation." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes flashed. "Girls are slyer than you think. Better to end it swiftly than drag the whole village through suspicion." Miss Marple nodded politely, but her eyes strayed to the garden visible through the drawing-room window. Tall foxgloves swayed in the border, purple and white, their bells catching the light. "What fine foxgloves you have this year," she said mildly. Mrs. Cartwright glanced out. "A nuisance plant. They seed everywhere. I tell the gardener to cut them down." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "they always spring up again." Later, Miss Marple found Florence Green outside the post office. The girl looked pale, her gloves clenched. "You seem troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. Florence glanced about, then whispered, "Mrs. Cartwright told me again it must be Lucy. She says the girl brooded and hated Mrs. Price, but I don't believe it. Lucy cried too honestly." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "Truth and falsehood do show themselves in tears, yes. Tell me, Florence, when the raffle began, where was Mrs. Cartwright?" Florence frowned. "I think near the cakes. She hurried with plates." "She always hurries." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, hurriedness is often very convenient. One may seem busy when one is in fact quite free." Florence looked at her blankly, but Miss Marple's mind was already working. That evening, Miss Marple invited the curate, Mr. Fenton, to tea under the pretext of advising on parish charities. He spoke warmly of the fate, though with sadness. "It is terrible, Miss Marple, that such wickedness could happen under God's roof," he said. "Wickedness," Miss Marple agreed, pouring tea steadily. "And yet, one wonders what form it takes. Do you think Robert Price capable of such an act?" Mr. Fenton hesitated. "He is careless, even selfish. But poison requires patience, forethought. I do not see it in him. And Lady Whitcomb, she is proud. But again, not subtle. Pride usually strikes openly, not in secret." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You are very shrewd, Mr. Fenton. Wickedness wears many disguises, but seldom one entirely foreign to the wearer." That night Miss Marple set her notes in order. Cloth. Faint bitter stain, not jam. Honey absent, yet Mrs. Price demanded it. Lucy consistent. no change in her account. Mrs. Cartwright, pressing for closure, mere cakes at crucial moment. Robert, debts, but too obvious. Lady Whitcomb, pride, but brittle, not practical. She underlined cloth twice. The faint bitterness troubled her. Not almond. No, that was for sensation novels. But bitterness without, sweetness dissolved by heat, that had the look of something carefully chosen. And foxgloves, though common as weeds, had long been known to provide just such a bitter draught. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. In her garden, too, foxgloves stood. Pretty, innocent-seeming, unless one knew their secret. Not Lucy, she murmured, not Robert. Not Lady Whitcomb, someone tidy, someone brisk, someone who knows a little too much of medicine. Her needles clicked again, each stitch a question, each row a quiet answer. By the second Sunday after the fete, Willowbrook's polite surface had begun to fray. The congregation filed into St. Michael's with whispers instead of greetings, and the sermon, though earnest on the subject of brotherly love, was received with more sidelong glances than nods. Mrs. Bartlett whispered to her neighbor that Robert Price had been seen at Marleycombe races, and Mr. Pottle told anyone who would listen that Lady Whitcomb's household accounts were in arrears. Each tidbit was presented with solemn gravity, as if a murder inquiry were simply the natural extension of parish life. Miss Marple, seated primly in her pew, folded her gloves and reflected that villages always reveal their truths in layers. At first came the ordinary gossip, who baked, who quarreled. Then, under strain, the darker matters surfaced: debts, secrets, jealousies. Willowbrook was no exception. Inspector Graves, too, had noticed the cracks, though he used them differently. He arrived at Robert Price's small lodgings with Constable Harris in tow and wasted little time. "You told me your debts were modest," Graves said, "but I have here 3 promissory notes, all unpaid." He laid them on the table. "Your aunt held them." Robert paled. She promised to extend the terms." "Did she?" Graves leaned forward. "Or did she threaten to expose you?" Robert's lips tightened. "My aunt enjoyed her little torments. She reminded me often enough that the house in Marleycombe would be mine only when she pleased." "And so you pleased yourself to hurry matters along?" Robert slammed his hand on the table. "No, I disliked her, yes. I wished her gone often enough. But poison at a public fete? It is absurd." From the doorway Miss Marple's gentle voice floated in. "Young men are seldom so patient. Poison requires a sort of domestic care. It is not usually their method." Robert shot her a grateful glance. Graves looked less pleased. That same afternoon, Lady Whitcomb received a discreet caller, Miss Marple herself. The ladies' drawing-room was immaculate, though a little shabby beneath its polish. The silver had been polished too often, as if to distract from the thinning velvet. "My dear Lady Whitcomb," Miss Marple said, "I have heard the most shocking whispers about your accounts. I do hope they are not troubling." Lady Whitcomb stiffened. "One manages. It is hardly the business of the village." "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Only I have found that financial discomfort often weighs more heavily on pride than on the purse itself. And pride, dear lady, can make us do extraordinary things." For a moment, Lady Whitcomb's composure faltered. Amelia Price delighted in reminding me of the clock. She would bring it up at every opportunity, as if it proved her cleverness. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "when you spoke with her at the fete, you did not touch her cup." Lady Whitcomb met her eyes squarely. "No, I did not." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you." The lady exhaled, a faint sigh of relief escaping before dignity reclaimed. Later that day, Miss Marple called at the doctor's house under pretext of inquiring after parish nursing supplies. Mrs. Cartwright greeted her with bustling warmth. "Inspector Graves is at least decisive," she said. "He knows the girl did it. These things are simple if one refuses to be muddled." "Life is often muddled, I find," Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Cartwright pressed her lips. "Then it ought not to be. A village cannot live under endless suspicion." As they spoke, Miss Marple's eyes wandered over the sideboard. A stack of medical journals lay neatly arranged. On top was one open to an article on digitalis, foxglove. She did not comment. "I wonder," she said instead, "if Dr. Cartwright ever used digitalis in his practice?" "Of course," Mrs. Cartwright replied quickly. "It is common enough. But I hardly see what relevance that has." "None at all," Miss Marple said sweetly, "except that one must be careful what grows in the garden." Mrs. Cartwright glanced toward the window where the tall foxgloves stood. "Nuisance plants," she said curtly. "I tell the gardener to cut them back." Florence Green, meanwhile, confided nervously to Miss Marple when she encountered her by the churchyard. "I cannot bear the way people speak of Lucy," she said. "Mrs. Cartwright told me again that she must be guilty. But Lucy is no liar. I feel sure of it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Your feelings do you credit, my dear. It is often the case that truth lies with those who cannot twist their stories." Florence hesitated. "And yet I did see something odd. When Mrs. Cartwright hurried past the cakes, she carried a spoon. I thought nothing of it then. But later, well, why would she need a spoon when she was only arranging plates?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her voice remained mild. "A spoon, you say?" "Yes. Sometimes the smallest of implements does the greatest work." That evening Miss Marple wrote carefully in her notebook. Robert's debts, serious but clumsy motive. Lady Whitcomb, pride, yes, but brittle. Lucy, story unchanged. Mrs. Cartwright, pressed for closure, near cakes with spoon. Foxglove and garden. Cloth with bitter stain. She underlined spoon twice. Inspector Graves might build his case against Robert or Lady Whitcomb, but Miss Marple knew better. Villages were tidy in appearance, but truth was rarely so. Human nature betrayed itself in trifles, a spoon, a cloth, a hurried movement at the wrong time. She folded her knitting and looked once more at the foxgloves nodding in the evening light. Beautiful, dangerous, and so very easy to dismiss as mere flowers. The village of Willowburg had grown weary. It is one thing to gossip over scones. It is another to live with suspicion gnawing at every doorstep. By the second week after Mrs. Price's death, tempers were shorter, faces more drawn, and even the children were hushed when adults lowered their voices. Inspector Graves announced firmly in the Crown and Anchor that the case was near its conclusion. "Evidence points squarely to Robert Price," he said. "He had debts, he had opportunity, and his aunt was on the verge of cutting him off. It is a simple business." Half the taproom nodded approval. The other half whispered that Lady Whitcomb was the true culprit, for had she not lost her clock and her dignity together? Both theories suited different prejudices. Both seemed plausible. Neither satisfied Miss Marple. She sat quietly at her fireside that evening, her knitting in her lap, when a hesitant knock sounded at the door. Opening it, she found Florence Green, pale and trembling. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" The girl whispered. "Of course, my dear. Sit by the fire. I will make tea." Florence sat on the edge of the chair, twisting her gloves until the seam strained. At last she burst out, "I cannot bear it any longer. I must tell someone." Miss Marple poured the tea without comment. When Florence's hands closed around the warm cup, the words tumbled out. "It was Robert," she whispered. "I saw him slip something into the basket." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Into Mrs. Price's basket?" Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Into Mrs. Price's basket?" Florence nodded quickly. "Yes, just before the raffle." I thought nothing of it at the time. He bent over, as if to admire the cloth, and his hand moved. I told myself it was nothing, but now, oh, Miss Marple, perhaps I let a murderer go free. Tears welled in her eyes, and she pressed her gloves to her face. Miss Marple let the silence sit for a moment. "Why did you not speak sooner, Florence?" "I was afraid," the girl confessed. "Afraid no one would believe me. Afraid of the shame it would bring. And then Robert saw me looking. He gave me such a smile. I thought it was nothing, but now it seems terrible." Miss Marple's eyes softened. Young women often mistake a smile for reassurance when it is in fact a warning. "But my dear, if you truly saw this, you must tell the inspector." Florence shuddered. "He will think I held it back on purpose. Mr. Fenton would be ashamed of me." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Mr. Fenton is a kind man. He will think you brave for speaking now." The next day Florence repeated her story to Inspector Graves, though haltingly. The inspector's face lit with satisfaction. At last, an eyewitness. "This settles the matter. Robert Price will answer for it." Robert was summoned, protesting furiously. "A lie! The girl imagines things." Florence flushed scarlet. "I saw you, Robert. You bent over the basket. You cannot deny it," Robert sneered. "And what precisely did I place there, Florence? Did you see a bottle, a packet? Or do you merely wish to impress your curate by playing the heroine?" The girl gasped, tears springing afresh. Mr. Fenton, standing nearby, put a protective hand on her shoulder. "Enough, Robert. She has spoken the truth as she saw it." Inspector Graves slammed his notebook shut. "It is enough for me. Means, motive, and now witness. I shall apply for a warrant." Miss Marple, who had been knitting calmly throughout, spoke at last. "It is curious, is it not, Inspector, how memory selects its moments? Florence did not recall this until yesterday, though she has been questioned several times." Graves scowled. "Young ladies forget themselves until their conscience pricks. It is perfectly natural." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "but I have found that memory, like jam, is seldom spread evenly. It clings in patches, sometimes the important ones, sometimes not." She rose, tucking her knitting neatly away. "I should not be too hasty in fastening the noose, Inspector. A basket is a convenient stage for many hands." Graves dismissed her words with a grunt. That evening Florence returned to Miss Marple's cottage, distraught. "He mocked me, Miss Marple. He said I imagined it." "Did I? Am I quite foolish?" Miss Marple poured another cup of tea. "No, my dear, you are not foolish. But perhaps you saw less, or more, than you realized. A movement, yes. But the meaning of it may not be what you suppose." Florence blinked through her tears. "You believe me, then?" "I believe you saw what you saw. The question is not whether Robert bent over the basket, but why." Alone again, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. Florence saw Robert at the basket. But Robert is clumsy, careless, incapable of subtle patience. The cloth bore a bitter stain, not jam. Lucy's tail remained steady. Mrs. Cartwright pressed for settlement. And always, the foxgloves in the doctor's garden. She tapped her pencil thoughtfully. Florence's story was sincere, but sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. A bent back, a moving hand, these could mean mischief or something else entirely. Miss Marple recalled another incident from years past in St. Mary Mead. A gardener accused of theft because he bent over the vicar's wall. In truth, he had been tying up a fallen rose. Suspicion often lies in the eye of the watcher, not in the act itself. "Robert may have bent," she murmured, "but whose hand truly touched the cloth?" Her needles clicked softly as she began another row. Each stitch was neat, deliberate, like the truth itself, which would in time reveal its pattern. At the Crown and Anchor that night, Robert's name was on every lip. Some believed the eyewitness sealed his fate. Others thought Florence too innocent to judge rightly. Only one thing was certain. The village was more divided than ever. And somewhere in Willowbrook, the real murderer, confident that Robert would now bear the weight of suspicion, allowed themselves a sigh of relief. Miss Marple, gazing out at the swaying foxgloves in the moonlight, thought otherwise. Relief, in her experience, was always premature. Inspector Graves was triumphant. "We have the girl's testimony," he declared to Mr. Clement, "and that is the last nail in Robert Price's coffin." Robert, meanwhile, paced furiously in his lodgings, swearing that Florence Green had lied. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened to leave Willowburg at once, though, curiously, he did not. Guilty men run. Robert only fumed. Miss Marple, who had watched many guilty men and more innocent fools, thought it curious. Robert had debts, yes, and a quick temper. But patience, planning, and poison were not in his character, and so she set about testing the village. The next afternoon she invited Mrs. Cartwright for tea. The doctor's wife arrived brisk, as always, her hat perfectly straight and her expression one of determination. "How weary the village is of this business," she said at once. "I do hope Inspector Graves acts swiftly. The girl Florence has done us all a service by speaking." Miss Marple poured tea steadily. Yes, Florence was very brave. And yet young eyes sometimes misinterpret. One must be cautious. Mrs. Cartwright's lips tightened. "Young eyes may be clearer than older ones." "True," Miss Marple said gently. "But they also see only what lies on the surface. A hand moving, for instance, might mean mischief or simply tiding. I notice, Mrs. Cartwright, you are often the one tiding. At the fete you seemed everywhere at once." The other woman colored faintly. "Someone had to keep order. The vicarage staff are hopeless at arrangements." "Order is admirable," Miss Marple said, her eyes mild, "though I have sometimes observed that the busiest hands are also the freest." Mrs. Cartwright's teacup rattled as she set it down. "Surely you do not suspect, my dear." "I suspect nothing. I merely observe." The following day Miss Marple strolled up to Lady Whitcomb's lodge with a posy of roses. The lady received her with chilly courtesy. "They are saying Robert is guilty," Lady Whitcomb said. "I cannot deny I'm relieved. It takes suspicion away from me." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet relief is often short-lived. One recalls things, one worries again. For instance, do you remember exactly where Mrs. Cartwright was when you spoke to Mrs. Price?" Lady Whitcomb frowned. "She was near the cakes, I believe, always arranging plates. She hurried past us once with a spoon. I thought it odd at the time." "Odd," Miss Marple repeated, as though testing the word. "Yes, very odd indeed." Lady Whitcomb sighed. "But surely the inspector knows best." "Inspectors," Miss Marple said, "see crimes. Villagers see people. Sometimes one must combine the two." Miss Marple's next call was on Florence Green, who was still pale from her ordeal. Mr. Fenton, the curate, was present, offering comfort. "You were very brave, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "To speak against Robert when the village is so divided took courage." Florence flushed. "I only told what I saw." "Indeed." A hand bent over the basket. "Very striking." She paused, then added softly, "And yet, Florence, do you recall whether that hand held anything?" Florence faltered. "No, only that it moved. I assumed." "Assumptions are dangerous," Miss Marple said gently. "Still, your courage has stirred the waters, and stirred waters show what lies beneath." Florence looked confused, but Mr. Fenton regarded Miss Marple with a thoughtful expression. "You believe, then, that Robert may not be guilty?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I believe that human nature seldom changes its habits. Robert's habits are of carelessness, not cunning. Poison, Mr. Fenton, requires tidiness." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small parish supper at the vicarage. The inspector was present, talking loudly of his coming success. The villagers gathered in little groups, whispering, watching one another. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, speaking kindly, asking small questions. She noticed how Robert blustered, How Lady Whitcomb maintained her stiff pride, how Florence trembled, and how Mrs. Cartwright smiled a little too brightly each time Lucy's name was mentioned. At last Miss Marple rose to her feet. "It is a dreadful thing," she said in her mildest voice, "when suspicion falls upon the wrong person. A girl's life, a young man's honor, even a lady's pride, all may be ruined by a single false step." The room fell silent. "Fortunately," Miss Marple continued, "truth has a way of showing itself in small details. A stain on a cloth, a spoon in the wrong place, a hand too busy at the right moment. Such things may seem nothing, but they tell a tale." There was a stir. Mrs. Cartwright's smile faltered. Inspector Graves snorted. "Pretty speeches, madam, but we have facts." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and we must follow the facts wherever they lead, even when they lead to places we do not wish to look." Her eyes, soft but steady, rested for a moment on Mrs. Cartwright. Then she resumed her seat and began to knit, the needles clicking softly. That night Willowburg buzzed anew. Some said Miss Marple had defended Robert. Others whispered she had accused Mrs. Cartwright outright. The village, already uneasy, was thrown into fresh confusion. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered. She had not accused, not truly. She had merely placed a little pressure, enough to see who flinched. And Mrs. Cartwright had flinched. Her notes now read, "Cloth, bitter stain. Spoon, in Mrs. Cartwright's hand. Foxglove, in doctor's garden. Busy hands, a cloak for mischief." Smile faltered, under pressure. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The pattern was nearly clear. Only a few more threads and it would be complete. The inspector might think the trap was closing on Robert. But Miss Marple knew better. The real trap had. The summer light in Willowburg had begun to change. The roses still bloomed, the lawns were still green, yet a shadow lingered over every gate and garden path. Villagers spoke in lower voices, as if the very hedges might be listening. Inspector Graves continued to prepare his case against Robert Price. "It is plain as daylight," he told Constable Harris. "Debts, inheritance, and now Florence's testimony. He will hang." But daylight, Miss Marple reflected as she trimmed her geraniums, is often deceptive. It shows much and hides more in the brightness. Human nature, too, loves to present itself as simple when it is anything but. She had begun to see the crime with greater clarity. A cup, a cloth, a moment of distraction. Not luck, but calculation. And calculation belonged not to Robert's careless character, nor to Lady Whitcomb's brittle pride. It belonged to tidy, bustling hands, hands that liked to arrange, to correct, to settle. Miss Marple began her morning with a call upon Lucy. The girl looked worn with worry, but her room was spotless, her small roses in water as before. "They still whisper, miss," Lucy said. "Mrs. Cartwright says again that it must be me. She told Mrs. Bartlett so." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Do not fret. Whispering is the village's chief occupation, but truth, like cream, rises to the top." She asked gently, "Lucy, when you poured the tea, did you notice anything peculiar about the cup? A taste? A smell?" Lucy shook her head. "Only that it was heavier than the others. Mrs. Price's was china, thick at the base. She liked it strong. Heavier, you say?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is interesting. A small difference often tells a large tale." Her next visit was to Lady Whitcomb. The lady was less stiff than before, almost relieved now that Robert had become the official suspect. "Justice will be done," she said firmly. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "And yet, I wonder, when you spoke with Mrs. Price, did she set her cup to the left or the right?" "To the left," Lady Whitcomb said after a pause. "Yes, certainly to the left." "I recall because her glove brushed mine." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought so." "And when she resumed her seat, she reached to the left again?" "Yes," Lady Whitcomb said. "But now you make me wonder." She seemed to hesitate a moment, as if the cup was not where she had left it. Perhaps I imagined it. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, or perhaps not. At the Crown and Anchor that evening, Robert Price was cornered by Inspector Graves. "You slipped something into the basket," Graves said bluntly. "I did not," Robert flared. I bent to examine the cloth. Amelia was forever parading her belongings. I thought it absurd she carried a cup in a cherry-patterned rag. "You expect us to believe you admired her sewing?" Robert sneered. "Not admired? Mocked. She had scolded me the day before for borrowing a knife from the inn. I muttered that she'd better wrap up her knives as well. Ask anyone nearby." Miss Marple, seated in the corner, said mildly, "He is telling the truth about mockery." Mrs. Bartlett herself repeated the remark to me. "Robert was indiscreet, yes, but indiscretion is not poisoning," Graves scowled. "The more you defend him, madam, the more suspicious it looks." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps I dislike to see tidy answers which do not fit the cloth." That night she sat by her fire, notebook open. She wrote carefully. Cup, set down to the left, resumed after raffle. Cloth, stain bitter, not food. Spoon, in Mrs. Cartwright's hand. Robert, mocked, bent over basket, but no subtlety. Lady Whitcomb, hesitated as if cup had shifted. Lucy, consistent, truthful. Mrs. Cartwright, pressing for closure, always tiding. Miss Marple tapped her pencil. Yes, the pieces were falling into place. The next morning she visited Dr. Cartwright under the pretext of seeking advice about a neighbor's chest pains. The doctor was courteous but weary. His eyes looked older than his face. "You prescribe digitalis sometimes?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Of course," he said. "It is common in heart cases. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Only I noticed the fine foxgloves in your garden. One cannot help thinking how strange it is that beauty and danger grow on the same stem." The doctor's face did not change. "They are plants, Miss Marple, nothing more." But Mrs. Cartwright, who had entered with a tray, snapped, "A nuisance plant. I tell the gardener to cut them down." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her teacup. "Do you indeed?" she said softly. That evening, a parish gathering was held in the hall. Inspector Graves spoke loudly of warrants and justice. Robert glowered, Lady Whitcomb sniffed, Florence wrung her gloves, Lucy wept. Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting, allowed the talk to circle. At last she said, "It is curious, is it not, how certain people are always in the right place at the right time? One hurries here, one tidies there, and by such bustle becomes invisible. One hand changes a cup while all eyes are on the raffle. One spoon stirs not sugar, but something else." The hall fell silent. Mrs. Cartwright flushed scarlet. "You cannot mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I mean only that human nature is very revealing. Some people cannot bear disorder. And sometimes they tidy too well." Graves frowned. "These are fancies, Miss Marple. We have testimony." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Testimony that saw a hand bend, but not what it carried. Testimony that remembered a cup, but not that it shifted. The cloth, Inspector, the cloth tells the tale. Something bitter clung to it, something that dissolves when scalding tea is poured." There was a stir in the hall. Florence gasped, Robert swore, Lady Whitcomb stiffened. Mrs. Cartwright's teacup slipped and rattled against its saucer. Miss Marple's eyes were serene. "We are very near the end, I think. A little patience, and the truth will show itself, as it always does." That night she wrote one final note: "Prepare demonstration. Tea, cups, cloth." The trap was almost ready. The murderer, who thought themselves safe behind Robert's bluster and Florence's testimony, would soon find that the neatest arrangements can be the easiest to unravel. Miss Marple folded her notebook, set it beneath her pincushion, and smiled. The pattern was clear now, each stitch in its place. All that remained was to draw the threads tight. The parish hall was unusually bright that afternoon. Mr. Clement had agreed somewhat nervously to allow Miss Marple the use of it. The trestle tables were set out as they had been on the day of the fete. A large urn gleamed in the corner, a row of cups stood ready, and on one table lay the cherry-patterned cloth that had lined Mrs. Price's basket. "Really, Miss Marple," Inspector Graves muttered, "I don't see the purpose of this play-acting. We already have our man." "You may," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but I do not. And until I am satisfied, I think it unwise to let matters rest. People, Inspector, are like cups of tea. Their true flavor comes out only when hot water is poured." The inspector snorted but said no more. One by one the chief figures of Willowburg arrived. Robert Price, sullen and defensive. Lady Whitcomb, upright in her dignity. Florence Green, pale but determined. Lucy, anxious and tearful. Dr. and Mrs. Cartwright, the former weary, the latter brisk. And of course the vicar and his wife, hovering with polite unease. Miss Marple greeted them with gentle courtesy. "You are very good to come. I thought it might be useful to revisit that day in comfort and without distraction. A little reenactment, if you will." Robert groaned. "This is absurd." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Absurdities are often most revealing." She directed Lucy to stand where she had poured the tea. "Now, my dear, would you show us once again how you filled Mrs. Price's cup?" Lucy, trembling, took the china cup and poured from the urn. "She had her own cup, miss, heavier than the rest. I filled it, then set it down here." "Just so," Miss Marple said. "And then Lady Whitcomb spoke to her?" Lady Whitcomb inclined her head. "Yes, she rose, leaving the cup here on the table." "Excellent. And the raffle was called." All eyes turned to the vicar. Mr. Clement cleared his throat. "Yes, I remember very well." Miss Marple turned her calm eyes upon the assembly. "So, for 1 or 2 minutes, the cup was unattended. Anyone passing might have touched it. A spoon, perhaps, might have been employed. Tell me, Mrs. Cartwright, where were you at this moment?" The doctor's wife stiffened. "At the cake stall, of course." "Busy, as I always am." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "So busy that Florence recalls you carrying a spoon. A curious thing when one is arranging plates." A flicker crossed Mrs. Cartwright's face, quickly suppressed. Miss Marple lifted the cherry-patterned cloth from the table. This cloth was lined in Mrs. Price's basket. When examined, it bore a faint stain. Not jam, not tea, but something bitter. Something that dissolves in boiling water. Digitalis, I think. There was a stir. Dr. Cartwright shifted uncomfortably. Lady Whitcomb gasped. "Digitalis," Miss Marple continued calmly, "is derived from foxglove. Beautiful flowers, so common they are scarcely remarked upon. And yet, in measured doses, useful for the heart. In larger ones, fatal." Her eyes rested gently on the doctor. "You have prescribed it, no doubt, sir." "Many times," Dr. Cartwright said quietly. "But it was not you who prepared the fete tables," Miss Marple went on. "It was your wife. Always tidy, always arranging, always urging that matters be settled. And it was she whom Florence saw, spoon in hand, at the critical moment." Mrs. Cartwright flushed scarlet. "You dare accuse me?" Miss Marple smiled serenely. "I accuse no one. I merely observe." She moved closer to the table, her voice soft, conversational. "Consider, everyone, how neat it was. Mrs. Price brought her own cup, wrapped in her own cloth, a little basket, her pride. The maid poured, the mistress scolded, the raffle was called. A moment's bustle, and the cup, when lifted again, no longer held plain tea, but tea laced with foxglove." Robert muttered, I told you I mocked her cup, nothing more." "Yes, Robert," Miss Marple said kindly. "Your foolishness was cruel, but not deadly. Poison requires patience and tidiness. Those are not your gifts." Lady Whitcomb pressed her lips. "And I?" "Your pride is sharp, Lady Whitcomb, but it strikes openly. You would not stoop to a teacup. No, the hand that moved quietly, efficiently, under cover of busyness, that was another." Her gaze rested on Mrs. Cartwright. The doctor's wife rose suddenly. "This is outrageous. To sit here and listen to the ramblings of an old woman. Inspector, you must stop this at once." Graves looked uncomfortable. "Miss Marple, you go very far." "Do I?" she asked softly. "Then let us prove it." She poured fresh tea into Mrs. Price's cup and wrapped it in the cherry-patterned cloth. "Mrs. Cartwright, would you be so good as to demonstrate how you tidied on that day? How you moved among the tables?" Mrs. Cartwright hesitated. "Come now," Miss Marple said gently. "It is only play-acting." With a stiff smile, Mrs. Cartwright reached for the cup. But her hand trembled, just slightly, and in her nervousness she moved it to the right side of the table, not the left, where Lady Whitcomb had sworn it had stood. "There," Miss Marple said quietly. "You see? Habit betrays us." Lady Whitcomb recalled Mrs. Price's cup was on the left. Yet Mrs. Cartwright places it on the right, because that is what she did on the day. She shifted it. She stirred it. And when Mrs. Price lifted it again, death was waiting. There was a stunned silence. Mrs. Cartwright's face was white, her eyes blazing. "You cannot prove." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "The cloth bears the stain. The spoon was seen in your hand, and your eagerness to settle the matter betrayed you from the first. You disliked Mrs. Price as much as anyone. More, perhaps, for she mocked your place in the village, did she not? A doctor's wife, but not of family. She had power over you, and you resented it." Mrs. Cartwright's breath came quick. "She ruined my husband's standing. She belittled him before patients, called his accounts into question. Do you know what it is, Miss Marple, to watch your husband's name dragged through the mud by a woman with money and malice?" Dr. Cartwright rose, stricken. "Eleanor, no." But Mrs. Cartwright's composure had cracked. "She deserved it," she cried. "I gave her only what she gave us, ruin." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Thank you, my dear. That is all I wish to hear." Inspector Graves stood rigid, his face dark. "By heaven," he muttered, "a confession." But Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not yet. Tomorrow, perhaps, you will have your confession in writing. For now, Mrs. Cartwright has only shown what I knew from the first, that guilt always betrays itself in the tiniest detail." She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly in the shocked silence. That night, Willowburg buzzed louder than ever. Some spoke of Mrs. Cartwright's sudden outburst, others of Miss Marple's quiet certainty. The inspector was shaken, Robert exonerated, Lady Whitcomb vindicated, Florence bewildered, and Lucy relieved. In her cottage, Miss Marple set her notebook aside. The pattern was complete. Only one chapter remained, the formal unraveling, the calm laying out of threads so that even Inspector Graves must see how the tapestry was woven. Tomorrow, she thought, the truth will be told in full. The morning after the reenactment, Willowburg woke uneasy. Rumors spread faster than the church bell. Mrs. Cartwright had faltered. Miss Marple had spoken, and the inspector had been left with more questions than he liked. By midday, Inspector Graves requested that all concerned gather once more at the vicarage drawing room. "We must have this put in order," he announced, "or the whole county will be laughing at us." Miss Marple arrived punctually, her knitting bag neat under her arm. She looked as gentle and unassuming as ever, but in her soft blue eyes lay the calm certainty of one who has seen the pattern entire. The room filled, Robert Price, sullen but curious. Lady Whitcomb, stiff with dignity. Florence Green, pale but hopeful. Lucy, wringing her hands. Dr. Cartwright, weary and grave, and Mrs. Cartwright herself, outwardly composed but with a restless flicker in her eyes. Inspector Graves stood at the mantel, arms folded. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, "you seem to have more to say. I invite you to say it plainly." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Very well, Inspector. You will recall that at the fete, Mrs. Price collapsed while holding her own teacup. It seemed natural to suppose that the cup was poisoned before the maid poured, or that she herself had brought something harmful. But that was not the case. The poison was introduced after the tea was poured, during those few moments when the raffle began and all eyes were upon the vicar. She turned her gaze gently upon Robert. Many suspected Robert, for he had debts and quarrels. Yet Robert is careless, impatient, and loud. Poison requires subtlety, planning, and patience. It does not suit his character. Moreover, though Florence saw him bend over the basket, he carried nothing in his hand. He mocked the cloth, nothing more. His folly was cruel, but not fatal. Robert let out a breath of relief, though his eyes still smoldered with resentment. Miss Marple continued. Others suspected Lady Whitcomb, for she had been humiliated over the clock. But pride of her sort is brittle, not cunning. Lady Whitcomb quarrels openly. She would not stoop to a teacup in public. And besides, she never touched the cup. Lady Whitcomb gave a small nod, her lips pressed tight. The cloth, Miss Marple went on, lifting the cherry-patterned square, was the key. On its corner lay a faint stain, bitter to the scent. Not jam, not tea, but digitalis, foxglove. When the boiling tea was poured, the poison dissolved. Mrs. Price lifted her cup again, and death was certain. There was a stir. Florence's eyes widened. Lucy gasped softly. "And who," Miss Marple asked gently, "was nearest the cup at the crucial moment? Who moved with bustling energy, arranging, tidying, spoon in hand? Who urged most strongly, from the beginning, that the matter be settled quickly before awkward questions might be asked?" Her eyes rested on Mrs. Cartwright.